Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. My shift started like any other. Coffee in one hand, radio crackling in the background, another long night ahead. I had been on the force for 8 years, working the night shift in a city that never really slept. We dealt with the usual: bar fights, break-ins, the occasional high-speed chase. Nothing I couldn't handle. At around 9:30 p.m., dispatch came through with a call that changed everything. Unit 4-5, we've got a disturbance at Oak Ridge Apartments, multiple reports of an altercation, possible injuries. I sighed, setting my coffee down. Copy that, en route. Oak Ridge was in a rough part of town. Lots of noise complaints, occasional fights. It was usually the same story: too much drinking. Someone gets upset, things get out of hand. I expected another routine call. I was wrong. When I pulled up to the complex, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No shouting, no music blaring from windows, just an eerie stillness. A few porch lights flickered, casting weak pools of light on the cracked pavement. I stepped out of my cruiser, radio in hand. Dispatch, I'm on scene, no visible disturbance. I'll check it out. As I moved toward the building, I heard something. A low, wet gurgling sound. It came from the stairwell leading up to the second floor. My hand instinctively went to my holster as I climbed the steps, heart pounding. At the top, I saw them. 3 people stood in the hallway, their backs to me, hunched over something on the ground. At first, I thought it was a fight, maybe a mugging. But then I saw the way they moved, jerky, unnatural. And the sound. That awful slurping noise. "Hey!" I barked, stepping forward. "Police! Hands where I can see them." They didn't react, didn't even flinch. That's when I saw the body on the ground. A man, his face pale, his chest unmoving. One of them turned toward me. I froze. His eyes were clouded over, lifeless, but he was standing. His mouth hung open and his jaw moved in a slow chewing motion. His face was smeared with something dark. I took a step back, my grip tightening on my weapon. "Sir, I need you to step away, now." He didn't listen. None of them did. Instead, they turned in unison, their movements sluggish but deliberate. That's when I saw the full extent of the nightmare. Their clothes were torn, their skin had an unnatural grayish hue, and their mouths dripped with something that made my stomach turn. One of them lunged. I didn't think. My training kicked in and I drew my weapon, firing a shot center mass. The impact barely slowed him down. My mind raced. This wasn't possible. People didn't just keep moving after a shot like that. But they did. And they were coming straight for me. My first shot should have stopped him. It didn't. He barely staggered before lunging again. I fired twice more, center mass, like I was trained, but it was useless. The other 2 were closing in, their clouded eyes locked onto me. I had seconds to act. I aimed higher. The shot echoed through the hallway. This time the man dropped instantly, collapsing like a puppet with its strings cut. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't have time to process it. The other 2 were still coming. I turned and ran. I hit the stairs 2 at a time, gripping the railing to keep from tripping. Behind me, I heard their footsteps, uneven, shuffling, but relentless. I made it to the parking lot, gasping for air. My cruiser was 10 feet away. I fumbled for my keys, but my hands were slick with sweat. A sound made me freeze. A woman, standing in the glow of a flickering street lamp. Her clothes were torn, and her head tilted unnaturally to one side as if her neck barely supported it. She swayed on her feet, her milky eyes staring straight through me. Then she moved. Not a sprint, not a run, but a steady lurching walk, like she had all the time in the world. I yanked open the car door and dove inside, slamming it shut just as she reached me. She hit the window with both hands, leaving smears of something dark across the glass. Her mouth opened and closed, like she was trying to speak but had forgotten how. I threw the cruiser into reverse and peeled out of the lot. My mind raced. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of drug, I didn't even know. But I had just watched a man take multiple shots to the chest and keep moving. That wasn't something any drug could do. I grabbed my radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4, 5. I have an emergency at Oak Ridge Apartments. I need backup and medical immediately. Something is seriously wrong." Static. "Dispatch, do you copy?" More static. I switched channels trying to reach another unit, nothing. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. I looked up, my hands gripping the wheel. The streets were quiet, too quiet. Normally, even at this hour, the city had life. Traffic lights changing, distant sirens, people walking the sidewalks. Now, nothing. I had to get back to the station. If anyone had answers, it would be them. I hit the gas, speeding through empty streets. Every intersection, every corner, I expected to see something. Someone. But the city felt abandoned. Then I saw the gas station. The lights inside were flickering, and the glass door was shattered. A figure stumbled out, dragging one leg behind them. Their head snapped toward me as I approached. I didn't stop. I kept driving, my stomach twisting into knots. Something terrible was happening, and I had a feeling it was only getting started. I drove fast, too fast. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, but I barely noticed. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. The streets were eerily empty. No cars, no pedestrians, just scattered debris and flickering streetlights. I passed a diner with its door hanging open, the neon "Open 24 Hours" sign buzzing weakly. Inside, chairs were overturned, napkins and silverware littering the floor. No people. Everywhere I looked, it was the same. Deserted. The station was a few blocks away. I kept my foot on the gas, weaving through abandoned intersections. The cruiser's radio was still dead, just static. No calls from other units, no dispatch, nothing. I turned onto 7th Street, my heart hammering. The station was just ahead. The front lot was full. Patrol cars, civilian vehicles, but no movement. No officers stepping outside, no familiar voices on the radio. Something was wrong. I pulled in fast, hitting the brakes hard. The tires screeched against the pavement as I threw the car into park. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the wheel. The entrance doors were slightly open. The lobby inside was dark. Normally, someone would be at the front desk. Officer Reynolds usually handled night shift intake, but his chair was empty, the computer screen casting a dim glow across the counter. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the car. The air was thick with silence, like the whole city was holding its breath. My boots echoed against the pavement as I approached the doors. I pushed one open, my other hand resting near my holster. Inside, the station felt hollow. The front desk was unattended. Papers were scattered across the floor. A coffee cup had been knocked over, its contents long dried into a brown stain on the counter. I swallowed hard and stepped further in. "Reynolds?" My voice barely carried. "Nothing." I moved down the hallway toward the squad room. The overhead lights flickered, casting long shadows against the walls. A bulletin board full of wanted posters and shift schedules fluttered slightly from the airflow of the busted AC vent. Then I heard it. A rustling sound, paper shifting, something moving just out of sight. I unholstered my weapon and stepped forward. "This is Officer Carter. Identify yourself." A low moan answered me. From the break room. I pushed open the door, and the smell hit me first. Something foul, like rotting garbage left out too long. Reynolds was there. Slumped over the table, his uniform stained dark. I exhaled in relief. "Reynolds! Hey man, you all right?" He moved. Slowly, he turned his head toward me, and my stomach dropped. His eyes were fogged over, lifeless, and his mouth hung slightly open. Then he stood. I took a step back. "Reynolds?" He lunged. I barely had time to react. I staggered back into the hallway, my boot slipping on something wet. Reynolds came after me, his movements stiff, unnatural, but fast. I raised my weapon. "Don't make me do this, man." He didn't listen. I fired. The shot rang through the station, but Reynolds didn't stop. Not until I aimed higher. His body hit the floor with a heavy thud, but I didn't move. My hands shook. My breath came fast and uneven. Reynolds was my friend, and now he was gone. I wiped my face with my sleeve, forcing my mind to focus. The station wasn't safe. I needed to get out. I needed to find out what the hell was going on. Reynolds wasn't the only one. The gunshot echoed through the station, and almost immediately I heard movement, shuffling footsteps, low groans drifting from deeper inside. I wasn't alone. I stepped backward, my weapon still raised, but my hands were trembling. I had just taken down a friend, someone I worked alongside for years. But whatever Reynolds had turned into, that wasn't him anymore. I forced my breathing to steady and moved fast. If Reynolds was infected, that meant others could be too. I needed to check the holding cells. The hallway stretched in front of me, lined with offices and evidence lockers. I reached for my radio again, even though I already knew it was useless. "This is Officer Carter. If anyone is still at the station, respond." Nothing. Just more static. I reached the heavy security door leading to the holding cells. It was slightly ajar. That wasn't normal. I pressed my shoulder against it and pushed inside. The overhead lights flickered, barely illuminating the row of barred cells. Some were empty. Others weren't. The first cell on the left held a man in a torn hoodie, his back against the bars. His head hung at an unnatural angle, and his fingers twitched against the floor. His breathing was slow, shallow. The second cell was worse. Two bodies, an officer and a detainee, lay in a heap against the far wall. The officer's uniform was ripped, his face pressed against the concrete floor, unmoving. The other man. His hands were still clenched in a death grip on the officer's vest, as if he had gone down fighting. Then I heard it. A low, rattling exhale. I turned sharply. The last cell on the right. A man stood inside, gripping the bars so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. His eyes were blank. His lips curled into something between a sneer and a snarl. His face was covered in dark smears, his breath coming in slow, ragged bursts. Then he lunged. His body slammed into the bars with enough force to rattle them, his hands clawing at the empty air between us. He let out a choked groan, pressing his face between the bars, snapping his teeth like an animal. I stepped back, heart hammering. He didn't stop. I turned and moved fast, making my way back toward the squad room. I needed to get out of here. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A loud click. The front doors. Someone, or something, had just come in. I pressed my back against the wall, weapon raised, trying to steady my breath. Footsteps. Slow, heavy. Then a voice. Weak, shaking. "Hello, is anyone here?" I nearly collapsed in relief. A survivor. I stepped forward, keeping my weapon lowered but ready. "Stay where you are. I'm coming to you." I rounded the corner and saw him. A man in his early 20s, dressed in a torn security guard uniform. His face was pale, his hands shaking. He looked like he had seen a ghost. When he spotted me, his knees nearly buckled. "Oh, thank God," he breathed. I thought I was the only one left. I grabbed his arm and pulled him inside, shutting the security door behind us. "What's your name?" "Daryl." "I work at the Westgate Mall. I don't know what's happening, man. People were fine, and then they weren't." His voice cracked. "I barely got out." I nodded, my mind racing. "Did you see anyone else?" Daryl swallowed hard. "Not anyone. Alive." I clenched my jaw and exhaled. The city was going dark. Communications were down. And whatever this was, it was spreading fast. The station wasn't safe anymore. It was time to leave. Daryl was shaking. His breathing was ragged, and his eyes darted around like he expected something to lunge at him from the shadows. I didn't blame him. "We need to move," I said, keeping my voice low. "This place isn't safe." Daryl nodded quickly, his hands twitching at his sides. Yeah, okay." I led him toward the back exit, past rows of empty desks and overturned chairs. The station felt hollow, like a tomb that hadn't realized it was abandoned yet. Then I heard it. A sharp, metallic clang from somewhere deeper inside. We both froze. I raised a hand, signaling Daryl to stay put, and crept toward the sound. My pulse pounded in my ears as I moved past the armory door, past the evidence lockers, past another bang, closer this time. Then a groan. I pressed my back against the wall, gripping my weapon tightly. A shadow flickered across the hallway ahead, a shape moving. I took a slow breath and stepped forward. As soon as I did, something lunged from the darkness. I barely had time to react before I was shoved backward, my boots skidding against the tiled floor. A weight crashed against me, a man, his hands grabbing at my vest, his breath hot and sour against my neck. His eyes were gone, milky and lifeless, but his strength was unreal. I twisted, slamming an elbow into his ribs. He barely reacted. His grip tightened, his teeth snapping inches from my face. I did the only thing I could. I kicked hard, forcing him back just long enough to aim. One shot. Straight to the head. His body went limp, collapsing to the floor in a heap. Daryl let out a sharp gasp behind me. "Oh my God!" I turned, heart still hammering. "We have to go, now." I grabbed Daryl's arm and yanked him toward the exit. Whatever was happening, it wasn't stopping. It was getting worse. The streets were changing. We burst outside into the night. The air was thick, stale, like a storm was coming. But there were no clouds, no wind. Just silence. Except, not quite. Somewhere in the distance, I heard them. Low, inhuman groans drifting through the streets. Daryl swallowed hard. "Where do we go?" I scanned the area. My cruiser was still in the lot, the driver's door flung open from when I first arrived. But now, the streets around us weren't empty anymore. Shadows moved between cars. Figures staggered across sidewalks. Some were barely recognizable as people anymore. They were spreading. "We need a car," I said. "Something with fuel." Daryl pointed across the street. "What about that?" I followed his gaze to a black SUV parked near a convenience store. The headlights were still on, the driver's side door open. Someone had left in a hurry. It would do. I moved fast, keeping low, Daryl right on my heels. Every step felt like we were balancing on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one loud noise, and a scream. Not from us. Down the street, a woman ran from an alley, her arms flailing wildly. She didn't get far. Figures emerged behind her, moving faster than before. They surrounded her, pulling her down as she kicked and thrashed. Her screams turned into something else, something worse. Daryl let out a choked noise, but I grabbed his wrist before he could do something stupid. "There's nothing we can do," I whispered. "Not now." He looked at me, eyes wide with disbelief, but didn't argue. We reached the SUV. I yanked open the door and checked the ignition. The keys were still inside. Lucky. I climbed in and motioned for Daryl to do the same. He slid into the passenger seat, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the seatbelt. The engine roared to life. Immediately, heads snapped toward us. The nearest ones, only a few yards away, started running. I slammed the gas. The tires screeched against the pavement as we peeled out, speeding down the empty streets. I didn't know where we were going. I just knew we had to keep moving, because nowhere was safe anymore. The SUV tore down the road, the city blurring past in streaks of neon and shadow. I gripped the wheel tight, knuckles white, scanning every intersection. Every street was the same. Abandoned cars, flickering lights, and those things moving between buildings, drawn to the sound of the engine. Daryl was shaking beside me. He hadn't said a word since we got in, just stared ahead, his fingers twitching against the door handle. "We need to find a safe place," I muttered, "somewhere defensible." Daryl finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "What about the mall?" I glanced at him. "It's built like a fortress," he continued. "Steel security gates, reinforced doors. If we can get inside and lock it down..." It wasn't the worst idea. The Westgate Mall was big, with multiple exits, backup generators, and storage. If we could barricade it properly, we might have a chance. I nodded. "All right, we head for the mall." Daryl exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "I hope we're not the only ones left." I didn't answer. I didn't want to say what I was thinking. We might be. The city was falling. We turned onto a main road leading toward the mall. That's when I saw how bad things really were. Cars were wrecked along the street, some smashed into lampposts, others flipped over completely. Storefronts were shattered, merchandise littering the sidewalks. Bodies, too many bodies, lay motionless on the pavement, some half slumped out of car doors. A few of them moved. Some crawled, some twitched. Daryl made a choked noise and looked away. I pressed the gas harder. The SUV roared down the street, weaving around debris. A few figures stumbled into the road, arms outstretched, but I didn't slow down. Not this time. Then I saw the barricade. About a block ahead, a cluster of police cruisers and civilian vehicles had been positioned across the road. A few were on fire, casting an eerie orange glow across the asphalt. The barricade wasn't empty. Figures moved between the cars. Some wore uniforms, but they weren't officers anymore. "Hold on," I muttered. Daryl barely had time to brace before I yanked the wheel, turning down a side street. The SUV skidded, tires screeching before straightening out. The detour took us through a neighborhood. Dark houses with doors left wide open, porch lights flickering, children's bikes abandoned on sidewalks. Then movement. Ahead, a man sprinted out from between two parked cars waving his arms. "Hey, stop! Please!" Daryl grabbed my arm. "We have to help him." I hesitated. I barely had time to process before something else emerged from the shadows behind the man. 3 of them. They were fast, too fast. I made a choice. I hit the gas. The man screamed as I swerved past, barely missing him. Daryl turned in his seat, watching as the figures tackled him, dragging him down. I kept driving. "You," Daryl swallowed hard, "you didn't even slow down." I gripped the wheel tighter. If I had, we'd be in the same position as him. Daryl didn't respond. He just stared at the dashboard, breathing hard. I wasn't proud of it, but I wasn't about to get us killed for someone I couldn't save. The roadblock, the mall was close, just a few more turns. But then, headlights. Bright, blinding, coming straight at us. Another vehicle, a black truck, was speeding from the opposite direction, swerving wildly. I barely had time to react. "Hold on," I yelled. The SUV screeched as I yanked the wheel, narrowly avoiding a head-on collision. The truck sped past, its horn blaring. Then it crashed, right into a gas station. The explosion hit instantly. A shockwave slammed into us, rattling the SUV as flames erupted, engulfing the building. Glass shattered, debris flying across the street. I lost control. The SUV spun out, tires screeching against pavement, before crashing into a light pole. My vision blurred, my ears rang. Daryl groaned beside me. I blinked, trying to refocus. The dashboard was cracked, the windshield spiderwebbed with fractures. The airbag had deployed, my chest aching from the impact. Then I heard them. The groans. The explosion had drawn them. Dozens of them. Shadows lurched toward the wreckage, drawn by fire and sound. Daryl coughed. We have to move." I shook off the daze and reached for the door handle. The mall was only a few blocks away, if we could make it. The wrecked SUV groaned as I shoved the door open, my legs unsteady as I climbed out. Smoke billowed from the burning gas station, thick and acrid, casting eerie shadows across the street. Daryl stumbled out on the other side, coughing hard. "Carter, we gotta move." He was right. The explosion had drawn them. Figures emerged from alleyways, side streets, and broken storefronts. Dozens of them moving toward the wreckage, eyes locked onto us. Some were fast, too fast. I grabbed Daryl's arm and pulled him forward. "Run!" We sprinted down the street, weaving between abandoned cars. The mall wasn't far, just a few more blocks, but every step felt like wading through quicksand. Behind us, the groans grew louder. I risked a glance over my shoulder. They were closing in. No safe way in. The mall's massive glass entrance loomed ahead. A few cars sat wrecked near the doors, but the building itself looked intact. Daryl gasped between breaths. Security shutters, probably still down. I cursed under my breath. He was right. Malls locked up at night. If the shutters were in place, we'd be trapped outside. We reached the parking lot, skidding to a stop near the entrance. Steel security gates were lowered over the doors. Locked. Daryl banged his fist against the metal. "No, no, no!" I spun around. They were almost here. Dozens, maybe more, pouring into the parking lot, moving between cars, groaning as they spotted us. We had seconds before they reached us. I grabbed Daryl's shoulder. "Loading docks." He blinked. "What?" "Behind the mall, deliveries might be open." It wasn't a plan. It was desperation. But it was all we had. We bolted along the side of the building, past dumpsters and shattered windows. The mall's back entrance came into view, a metal security door near the loading docks. I yanked the handle, locked. Daryl let out a panicked breath. "What now?" I stepped back, scanning the door. It was reinforced, but not as strong as the front gates. I raised my gun. Bang! The first shot barely dented the lock. The second cracked the frame. The third blew it open. I kicked the door, sending it swinging inward. "Inside now!" Daryl didn't hesitate. He rushed in, and I followed, slamming the door behind us. The mall wasn't empty. Darkness swallowed us as we stumbled inside. The only light came from dim emergency signs lining the halls. It was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Daryl gulped. Are we alone? I didn't answer. Something felt wrong. I raised my weapon and stepped forward. The air was thick, stale, carrying the faint scent of decay. The loading area stretched ahead, empty crates, forklifts, and scattered pallets. Then I heard it. A rustling noise. Daryl tensed. Did you hear that? I nodded, eyes scanning the darkness. Another sound. A soft shuffle. Then a whisper. Hey, don't move. I turned sharply, gun raised. A figure emerged from behind a stack of crates. A man. Middle-aged, wearing a torn security uniform, holding a crowbar and shaking hands. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken from exhaustion. He stared at us, lips pressed into a tight line. Daryl raised his hands. We're not infected. The man's grip on the crowbar loosened, his shoulders sagged, and he exhaled sharply. You're the first living people I've seen in hours. I lowered my weapon slightly. How many are inside? The man hesitated. A few. We locked down the main halls, but... He swallowed hard. Some of them got in. Daryl's breath hitched. Inside the mall? The man nodded grimly. Yeah. I clenched my jaw. Of course it wasn't safe. Now we were trapped inside with them. The mall was silent, but it wasn't empty. I kept my weapon raised, scanning the darkened loading area. The security guard, his name was Howard, led us deeper inside, his grip on the crowbar tense. There's a few of us left, he muttered. Not many. Daryl swallowed. How did they get in? Howard glanced at him. Same way you did. Back door wasn't locked in time. I clenched my jaw. That meant some of them had made it inside. Somewhere in the mall, they were lurking. Waiting. The survivors. Howard led us through a dimly lit hallway toward a storage room. Inside, 5 people huddled together. 2 women, 2 men, and a teenager. Their faces were gaunt, their clothes dirty. One of the women, mid-40s, sharp eyes, stepped forward. Who are you? Carter, I said. This is Daryl. She crossed her arms. You bring anything useful? I held up my gun. Ammo, skills. She nodded slowly. I'm Linda, used to manage one of the stores. We've been holed up here for hours. Daryl looked around. Why aren't you in the main mall? It's more secure. Linda's face darkened. Howard sighed. We tried. Some of us didn't make it. I understood immediately. They had tried to clear the mall but lost people in the process. Now they were hiding, hoping to wait it out. But there was no waiting this out. We need to move, I said. This won't hold forever. Linda shook her head. Where? The streets are worse. She wasn't wrong. But staying put wasn't an option. Something was coming. A sound echoed through the hall, a low thud. Then another. Something was moving. Daryl's breath hitched. Tell me that's one of us. Howard paled. No. The sound grew louder, shuffling footsteps, slow but deliberate. Then a groan. It was close. I turned off my flashlight, signaling for silence. The group huddled together, eyes wide with fear. I moved toward the door, gripping my gun. Then something slammed against it. Daryl flinched. Another slam, harder this time. The door rattled. I backed up. That won't hold. Linda cursed under her breath. There's an exit through the food court. If we can get there. The door burst open. A figure lurched forward. A man in a torn security uniform, his eyes milky, his jaw slack. Then another, and another. They were inside. The final stand. Chaos erupted. Howard swung his crowbar, cracking one across the skull. It barely slowed. Linda grabbed a metal pipe, swinging wildly. I aimed and fired. The first shot took down the leader, the second missed. One of them lunged at me, too fast. I barely dodged, stumbling back as it grabbed my vest. Then, bang! Daryl fired, hitting it in the chest. Not enough. I twisted, slamming my elbow into its head, knocking it back. Linda yelled, "We have to run." I grabbed Daryl's arm. "Move!" We sprinted through the halls, dodging wreckage, pushing past fallen shelves. The food court loomed ahead, glass doors leading outside. They were locked. Howard fumbled with a key ring. Come on, come on." They were right behind us. Daryl turned, breath ragged. "We won't make it." I raised my gun. One shot left, a choice. Then, the door clicked open. Howard shoved it wide. "Go!" We barreled through, stumbling into the parking lot. Linda slammed the door shut behind us. Inside, the figures smashed against the glass, their lifeless eyes locked onto us. But they couldn't reach us. For now. The end of the beginning. The sky was turning gray. Dawn. Daryl exhaled sharply. We made it. Linda wiped sweat from her brow. For now. Howard looked at me. What now, officer? I glanced back at the mall, then at the city beyond. Smoke rose in the distance, fires burned. Sirens had stopped. The world we knew was gone. But we were still here. And we weren't done fighting. Not yet. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.